The word hung in the frozen air between them like a curse made manifest. Papa. Matthias felt his supernatural composure, cultivated through 3 centuries of methodical hunting, disintegrate like morning frost under sunlight. The child stood motionless in the swirling snow, her dark hair whipping around a face that seemed carved from moonlight itself. She was impossibly pale, even for these mountain villages where winter leached color from everything it touched. But it was her stillness that unsettled him most. No mortal child could remain so calm in a blizzard that had already claimed 2 travelers this week. "You're mistaken, little one." His voice emerged rougher than intended, the carefully modulated tone he used to lure victims cracking like ice over deep water. "I have no children." The lie tasted like ash on his tongue, though he told himself it was truth. Matthias Corvain, the terror of the Carpathians, had no offspring. The man who might have been called father had died in 1547, buried beneath 300 years of blood and calculated cruelty. The girl tilted her head, studying him with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "The wood is heavy," she said simply, as if she hadn't just shattered his world with a single word. "Will you help me carry it home?" Everything about this encounter violated the natural order. Children fled from him when they were wise enough to sense what he was. The few times he'd been careless enough to let mortals glimpse his true nature, they had screamed, prayed, or begged. They did not make polite requests about firewood. Matthias circled her slowly, his predatory instincts warring with something deeper and more disturbing. She smelled wrong. Humans carried the scent of warm copper and salt, the promise of sustenance that had driven him through countless nights of hunting. This child smelled of winter itself, of pine needles and snow-laden earth, and something else he couldn't identify, something that reminded him of forgotten prayers. "Where are your parents?" he asked, testing. No one should send a child out in such weather. "Mama is waiting." She gestured toward the dark tree line where cottage lights should have been visible, but weren't. "She said you would come tonight." The wind shifted, carrying with it the phantom scent of wood smoke and something that might have been bread baking. Matthias had not needed mortal food for 3 centuries, but the smell awakened a hunger different from the bloodthirst that usually consumed him. It awakened memories he had thought safely buried. A cottage with warm golden light spilling from frost-etched windows. The sound of humming, a lullaby he'd known once, when he'd been someone else entirely. Small hands reaching for him, trusting and innocent, before he'd learned that trust was a luxury monsters couldn't afford. "What is your name, child?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Sarah." She bent to lift the bundle of wood, her small frame struggling with the weight. "Will you help me, Papa? It's getting late, and Mama worries." "Sarah." The name hit him like a physical blow. Not possible. That name belonged to the past, to the mortal life he'd abandoned, to the family he'd— "You cannot be Sarah," he whispered, and for the first time in centuries, his voice carried genuine emotion. "Sarah is dead." The child, this impossible, wrong child, looked up at him with infinite sadness. Death isn't always what we think it is. She extended one small hand toward him. "Please, Papa, I've been waiting so long." Matthias stared at the outstretched hand, every supernatural instinct screaming warnings. In 300 years of undeath, he had learned to trust his predatory senses above all else. They had kept him alive when other vampires had fallen to hunters, priests, or their own carelessness. Now those same instincts told him to flee, to put distance between himself and this child who wore a dead name and called him by a title he'd forfeited long ago. But beneath the supernatural awareness lay something more primal, a recognition that bypassed logic entirely. The curve of her cheek, the way she held her head when concentrating, the unconscious gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, details that belonged to memories he'd spent 3 centuries trying to forget. Against every survival instinct he possessed, Matthias reached out and grasped her hand. The cold that met his fingers was deeper than anything he'd experienced in his undead existence. It wasn't the mere absence of warmth. It was winter given form, a chill that seemed to seep directly into what remained of his soul. Where their skin touched, frost began to form, delicate crystalline patterns that spread up his arm like living lace. And then, for the first time since his transformation, the hunger vanished. The constant, gnawing need for blood that had driven every decision for 3 centuries simply stopped. The supernatural strength that allowed him to tear through mortals like parchment faded. Even his enhanced senses dimmed until he was left feeling startlingly, terrifyingly human. "Come," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority no 7-year-old should possess. "Mama is waiting, and we have so much to discuss." Still holding his hand with fingers colder than grave earth, she began walking toward the dark woods, where no path existed and no cottage could possibly stand. The path that shouldn't exist wound through trees that grew too close together, their branches interlocked overhead like arthritic fingers. Matthias allowed himself to be led deeper into woods he had hunted for decades, woods where every shadow and game trail should have been familiar territory. Yet with each step, the landscape seemed to shift around him, as if the forest itself was reshaping to accommodate their passage. His diminished senses registered details that should have alarmed him. The absolute silence where night birds should have called, the way their footsteps left no impression in snow that crunched beneath their feet, the fact that despite walking steadily uphill, his breathing remained even and unlabored. For 3 centuries, he had not needed to breathe except to speak. Now his lungs worked automatically, drawing in air that tasted of pine and something sweeter, something that reminded him of honey cakes cooling on a wooden table. "The wood will burn well tonight," Sarah said conversationally, as if leading an ancient vampire through an impossible forest was no more remarkable than an evening stroll. "Mama has been cold lately." Matthias found himself studying the child's profile in the dim moonlight that filtered through the canopy. The resemblance was unmistakable now. The stubborn set of her jaw when concentrated, the way she favored her left foot slightly when walking. Details no imposter could have known, because he had never spoken of them to anyone in all his years of undeath. His existence had been one of careful isolation, punctuated only by the necessities of feeding. He maintained no relationships, formed no attachments, cultivated no habits that might make him predictable to those who hunted his kind. The closest thing he had to a routine was the methodical way he selected prey. Travelers first, then village outcasts, always careful to avoid patterns that might draw unwanted attention. Yet now, with his supernatural abilities muted, he felt the weight of that isolation like a physical burden. 300 years of nights spent alone in abandoned ruins and forgotten crypts. 300 years of viewing every human interaction as a transaction ending in death. 300 years of successfully avoiding anything that might remind him of warmth, of family, of the life he had lost. The cottage appeared gradually, as if materializing from the shadows between one step and the next. It was exactly as he remembered. Low stone walls chinked with moss, a thatched roof heavy with snow, windows that glowed with amber light. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream, and he could hear the soft crackle of a well-tended fire. "This is impossible," he breathed. "I watched it burn." Sarah squeezed his hand, and the cold spread further up his arm, bringing with it a strange numbness. "Many things seem impossible until we understand them differently." Through the frosted windows, he caught a glimpse of movement, a woman's silhouette passing back and forth as if preparing a meal. She moved with the same graceful efficiency he remembered, humming a melody that made his chest tighten with emotions he had thought dead and buried. The life he had built since his transformation was predicated on the absolute certainty that this could never happen. His cottage had burned. His family had died. He had mourned them in the way vampires mourned, briefly, violently, and then never again. The grief had been compartmentalized, locked away in the same mental vault where he kept his human memories. It was the only way to survive centuries of existence as a predator. But survival had required sacrifices beyond the obvious. He realized now how carefully he had constructed his hunting patterns to avoid families with young children, how he gravitated toward solitary travelers and lone wanderers, how he had never, in 300 years, entered a dwelling that might remind him of home. The cottage door opened, and warm light spilled across the snow. "Sarah?" The woman's voice carried the same gentle concern he remembered, touched now with something that might have been relief. "Did you find him?" "Yes, Mama." Sarah tugged his hand, drawing him toward the threshold. "Papa was exactly where you said he would be." Matthias felt his remaining resistance crumble. The woman in the doorway wore the same dark hair, the same knowing eyes, the same patient expression she had worn when waiting for him to return from long journeys. She looked exactly as she had the last time he saw her, the last time he had failed to protect her. His existence as Matthias Corvain, terror of the Carpathians, suddenly felt like a costume he had worn for so long he had forgotten it was not his true skin. The cottage represented everything he had convinced himself was lost forever: warmth, belonging, the possibility of being something other than a monster. Yet even as Sarah led him toward the door, part of him catalogued escape routes and calculated distances. 3 centuries of predatory instinct could not be silenced completely, even by this impossible reunion. The woman stepped aside to let them enter, and her smile was exactly as he remembered: gentle, knowing, and touched with a sadness that spoke of forgiveness he was not certain he deserved. The threshold between snow and warmth should have been a simple step. Instead, crossing into the cottage felt like passing through the membrane between worlds. The moment Matthias's boot touched the worn wooden floor, reality seemed to exhale around him, a long-held breath finally released. The interior was impossibly, painfully familiar. The same rough-hewn table where he had once carved wooden toys. The same hearth where fires had crackled through countless winter nights. Even the smell was correct: beeswax candles, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and beneath it all, the scent of home that he had trained himself to forget. "Elena," he whispered, the name scraping his throat like broken glass. His wife, for what else could he call her, despite the impossibility, closed the door behind them with deliberate care. "You look tired, my love. Older than when you left." The understatement might have been laughable if it hadn't landed like a blade between his ribs. 3 centuries of accumulated sins had carved lines deeper than time alone could manage. His reflection, when he bothered to look upon it, showed a man weathered by choices no mortal was meant to make. "I left 300 years ago," he said, testing the words against the warm air. "You burned. The cottage burned. I watched from the tree line as the flames consumed everything," Elena finished softly. She moved to the fire, adding wood from the bundle Sarah had struggled to carry. Each log caught immediately, flames dancing higher as if eager to welcome the fuel. "Yes, we remember. We remember." The phrase settled over him like a shroud. Matthias had spent centuries perfecting the art of forgetting. Forgetting warmth, forgetting love, forgetting the weight of Elena's hand in his or the sound of Sarah's laughter echoing through these same rooms. Yet they remembered. They had been remembering, while he had been choosing to forget. Sarah released his hand finally, and began removing her snow-dampened cloak. Beneath it, she wore a simple woolen dress that Elena had sewn. He recognized the careful stitching, the pattern of flowers embroidered along the hem, details that belonged to a life he had abandoned. "Sit," Elena said, gesturing toward his old chair by the fire. "You must be hungry." The invitation struck him as both natural and impossible. He had not been hungry for food in 3 centuries. His appetites had narrowed to a single driving need that painted the world in shades of predator and prey. Yet as the warmth of the cottage seeped into his unnaturally cold flesh, he felt something that might have been actual hunger, the mortal kind that spoke of empty stomachs rather than empty veins. But sitting meant accepting this impossible reality. It meant acknowledging that his carefully constructed existence, built on the certainty that his past was irrecoverable, might be founded on lies he had told himself. The chair waited, exactly where he had left it, worn smooth by years of use before his transformation had ended such simple pleasures. "This cannot be real," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "The dead do not return. The burned do not rebuild. I know what I am, what I have become. Monsters do not get second chances. Elena paused in her preparation of what smelled like bread and soup, simple fare that made his chest ache with memory. Perhaps the question is not whether this is real, but whether you are brave enough to find out. Through the cottage windows, the world outside had shifted again. Where moments before the forest had pressed close around them, now he glimpsed the lights of Harrow's End village scattered across the valley below. Impossible geography that rearranged itself according to rules he did not understand. Sarah settled on the rug before the fire, her small hands extended toward the flames. The firelight revealed details that made his undead heart stutter, a small scar on her wrist from when she had fallen learning to walk, a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her left ear. Markers of identity that no phantom could possess. "The choice is yours," Elena said quietly, ladling soup into a wooden bowl he had carved during their first winter together. "You can leave, return to the forests and the feeding, to the careful isolation you have perfected. Or—" She did not finish the sentence, but he heard the weight of possibility in her silence. The cottage offered warmth, acceptance, the chance to remember what he had been before hunger and blood had defined his existence. Yet accepting it meant abandoning everything he had built since his transformation. 3 centuries of careful adaptation, of survival strategies honed through countless close calls with hunters and rival predators. The old chair creaked as he finally sat, the familiar sound triggering memories of winter evenings when such choices had been simple. Whether to mend harnesses or carve toys, whether to bank the fire high or save wood for morning. The complexity of his current existence felt suddenly exhausting. Outside, snow continued to fall on a world that might or might not be real. Inside, his wife and daughter waited for him to choose between the monster he had become and the man he had once been, assuming, of course, that such a choice was even possible after 3 centuries of accumulated darkness. Matthias gripped the carved armrests of his chair, knuckles white against the worn wood. The bowl of soup steamed before him on the small table Elena had positioned within reach, its savory scent triggering a cascade of memories he had spent centuries suppressing. His hands trembled, an alarming development for a creature who had not experienced such mortal frailties since his transformation. "I have killed," he said suddenly, the words erupting from some deep wellspring of confession. "Hundreds, perhaps thousands. I have torn throats and drunk deeply while mothers bled out in front of their children. I have fed on innocents who trusted the wrong stranger on dark roads." Elena continued her quiet movements around the cottage, neither condemning nor absolving. Sarah hummed softly by the fire, apparently unconcerned that her father was confessing to centuries of murder. The domestic tranquility felt obscene against the weight of his admission. "I remember," Elena said simply, hanging herbs to dry from the rafters. "Every life, every choice. Every night you convinced yourself there was no alternative." The casual acknowledgement struck him like a physical blow. She spoke of his crimes the way she might discuss the weather, with complete awareness but no visible judgment. It was worse than revulsion would have been. Revulsion he could understand, could use to justify his isolation. This gentle acceptance threatened the very foundation of his self-imposed exile. "You cannot forgive that," he whispered. "No one could." "Forgiveness assumes wrongdoing," Sarah said without looking up from the fire. Her child's voice carried an authority that made his skin crawl. "Perhaps the question is whether you can forgive yourself for surviving." Surviving. As if 3 centuries of predation had been mere endurance rather than choice. As if each feeding had been necessity rather than the gradual surrender of whatever humanity had remained after his transformation. The cottage's warmth felt suddenly stifling, pressing against him like an accusation. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone. "This is madness. You speak as if my existence has been suffering rather than sin, as if I have been victim rather than victimizer. I chose this. Every death, every feeding, I chose it." "Did you?" Elena turned to face him fully, and her eyes held depths of sorrow he remembered but had never fully comprehended. Or did you choose the only path you believed was left to you after losing everything that made existence bearable? The question struck at the heart of his carefully maintained narrative. He had told himself for 3 centuries that he embraced his vampiric nature, that he had willingly abandoned human morality for the elegant simplicity of predator and prey. It was easier than admitting that every dawn had been another day he chose not to walk into sunlight. Easier than acknowledging that his isolation had been armor against hope as much as protection from hunters. The bowl of soup cooled before him, its surface forming a thin skin that reminded him uncomfortably of how blood congealed when left exposed to air. His stomach, an organ he had thought long dormant, clenched with what might have been hunger. The sensation was alien after centuries of existing on borrowed warmth and copper salt sustenance. "If I stay," he said slowly, "if I accept this impossible gift you offer, what becomes of what I am?" The hunger does not simply disappear. The need for blood, the strength, the immortality, these are not clothes I can discard. Sarah looked up from the fire, her young face grave. What if they already have? The observation sent ice through his veins colder than even her touch had managed. Since entering the cottage, he had not felt the familiar gnawing hunger. His supernatural hearing had dimmed to mortal levels. Even his enhanced night vision had faded, until he relied entirely on firelight to see clearly. The realization was terrifying. If his vampiric nature was somehow suspended, what guarantee did he have that it would return if needed? "I have enemies," he said desperately. "Other vampires who would see weakness as opportunity, hunters who have tracked me across decades. If I lose my abilities, then you would be mortal again," Elena said gently. "Vulnerable, dependent on others for protection, rather than surviving through strength alone." Mortal. The word carried implications he had not considered for 3 centuries. Mortality meant aging, dying, leaving behind whatever he managed to build in the interim. It meant accepting the limitations he had transcended through his transformation. Most terrifyingly, it meant trusting in things beyond his own power to control outcomes. The cottage felt like a trap constructed from his deepest longings, warm where his existence had been cold, accepting where he had known only isolation, hopeful where he had embraced despair. Yet traps were only effective if the prey desired the bait, and despite every survival instinct screaming warnings, he realized he wanted nothing more than to believe this impossible reunion was real. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling shutters and sending snow spiraling past the windows. The sound reminded him of countless nights spent in abandoned ruins, listening to storms and waiting for dawn so he could seek shelter from light that would destroy him. The contrast with the cottage's cozy security was almost unbearable. The soup bowl waited, cooling slowly in the firelight, while his wife and daughter watched him wrestle with 3 centuries of accumulated fear. The soup bowl sat between him and everything he had been before. Such a simple thing, carved wood worn smooth by years of use, filled with broth that carried the scent of herbs Elena had grown in the garden behind their cottage. Before the burning, before the transformation, before 3 centuries of telling himself that such simple pleasures were forever beyond his reach. Matthias lifted the spoon with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. The first taste should have been impossible. His palate had adapted long ago to the metallic tang of blood, losing sensitivity to mortal flavors. Yet the soup bloomed across his tongue with startling clarity, root vegetables, barley, the faint sweetness of carrots Elena had somehow coaxed from the rocky mountain soil. He was halfway through the bowl before he realized he was weeping. The tears fell silently into the broth, and he made no effort to stop them. 300 years of accumulated grief demanded their due, for Elena's death, for Sarah's lost childhood, for every choice that had led him deeper into the darkness of his vampiric existence. Each spoonful tasted of memory and possibility in equal measure. "There's no returning from this," he whispered, setting down the spoon. "If I accept what you're offering, if I believe this is real, then everything I've built since that night crumbles. Every justification, every carefully constructed reason for survival becomes meaningless." Elena settled into the chair across from him, her hands folded in her lap with the same patient grace he remembered. Perhaps that's not loss, but liberation. Liberation? The word came out sharper than he intended. I have survived 3 centuries by accepting what I am, by embracing the hunger instead of fighting it, by choosing isolation over the risk of caring for something I could lose again. You call that imprisonment? I call it fear, Sarah said softly from her place by the fire. She had not looked at him since he began eating, but her words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Fear of being hurt, fear of failing to protect what you love, fear of discovering that the monster was a choice rather than a necessity. The accusation struck home with surgical precision. He had spent 3 centuries telling himself that his isolation was strength, that his emotional numbness was wisdom. Yet here, surrounded by warmth and acceptance he had convinced himself was impossible, he felt the hollowness of his existence like a physical wound. I killed for blood, he said desperately, as if confession might rebuild the walls crumbling around his heart. I stalked humans through snow exactly like this. I chose victims based on their loneliness, their vulnerability. How is that fear rather than evil? Because, Elena said gently, evil would have enjoyed it. The observation silenced him completely. In 3 centuries of feeding, he had never once taken pleasure in the hunt itself. Each kill had been necessity, performed with the mechanical efficiency of a man chopping firewood or drawing water. He had taught himself to see humans as resources rather than people because the alternative, acknowledging their hopes, dreams, families, would have made survival impossible. Evil would have reveled in power over others, Elena continued. Evil would have accumulated followers, built empires of fear, delighted in causing pain for its own sake. You did none of those things. You fed when necessary and retreated into solitude. You survived, but you never embraced what you had become. That doesn't absolve. It doesn't need to. Sarah finally turned from the fire, her young face grave with understanding no child should possess. Absolution was never the goal. The goal was remembering who you were before fear convinced you that love was too dangerous to risk. Outside, the wind was dying down, and through the frost-etched windows, he glimpsed something that made his remaining protests stick in his throat. Stars were emerging between the clouds, not the harsh, distant lights that had watched over his centuries of wandering, but the warm, familiar constellations that had shone above this cottage during his mortal life. The sky itself had rearranged to welcome him home. Matthias set down the empty soup bowl and looked at his hands. The claws had retracted completely, leaving only human fingernails beneath the accumulated grime of his travels. His reflection in the bowl's surface showed eyes that were brown rather than crimson, tired rather than predatory. If I stay, he said quietly, there's no guarantee I can protect you any better than I did before. I failed once. The cottage burned. You died. What makes this time different? Elena reached across the table and covered his hands with her own. Her touch was warm, vibrantly alive, carrying the pulse of mortal blood beneath skin that felt entirely real. This time, she said, you don't have to protect us alone. The threshold he had crossed was not merely the cottage door, but the space between the monster he had become and the man he had been. There would be no retreating to the comfortable certainty of his vampiric existence, no returning to the elegant simplicity of predator and prey. Whether redemption was possible remained to be seen. But for the first time in 3 centuries, Matthias Corvain was willing to find out. The cottage walls shuddered as something massive struck the door. Matthias jerked upright from the table, his mortal reflexes sluggish compared to the supernatural speed he had possessed mere hours ago. The sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic pounding that made the iron hinges strain and sent a ceramic mug, tumbling from its shelf to shatter against the stone floor. Matthias Corvain! The voice that bellowed through the wood carried the authority of centuries. I know you shelter within. Come out and face judgment for your betrayal. Elena's face had gone pale, but she moved with practiced efficiency toward the cottage's rear window. Sarah remained by the fire, apparently unconcerned, though her small hands had begun weaving patterns in the air that left traces of silver light. "Victor," Matthias breathed, recognizing the voice of his former coven master. The vampire who had found him dying in the ruins of this very cottage 3 centuries ago, who had offered immortality as an escape from unbearable grief. How did he— "The rules of this sanctuary are not absolute," Elena said quietly, securing the window's iron shutters. "Your transformation created bonds that transcend mortal geography. When you chose to reclaim your humanity, those bonds became agitated." The pounding ceased abruptly, replaced by a sound far more ominous. The scrape of claws against wood as Victor began systematically dismantling the door. Each groove cut deep, revealing the supernatural strength that Matthias had lost. His former abilities seemed like distant dreams now, leaving him vulnerable as any mortal man facing a creature of endless hunger and rage. 3 centuries I invested in your education. Victor's voice carried through the splintering wood. 3 centuries of teaching you to embrace your true nature, only to have you flee to this pathetic charade of domesticity. You will return with me, or I will ensure this family burns a second time. The threat galvanized something primal in Matthias's chest, not the cold calculation of his vampiric existence, but the fierce protectiveness of a man defending his hearth. He moved toward the door despite his mortal limitations, only to find his path blocked by a figure that materialized from shadows that shouldn't have existed within the cottage's warm light. The newcomer stood barely taller than Sarah, draped in robes that seemed woven from starlight and winter wind. Her face was ageless in the way of ancient things, neither young nor old, but carved from the essential idea of wisdom itself. When she spoke, her voice carried the whisper of snow falling on silent forests. "Victor Dracul oversteps his authority," she said, raising one hand toward the door. The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by a frustrated snarl from outside. "This sanctuary exists beyond the reach of vampire politics. Who are you?" Matthias demanded, though some deeper part of him already suspected. "I am the keeper of thresholds," the figure replied, "guardian of spaces between what was and what might be. Your cottage exists within such a space, neither fully among the living nor completely removed from the realm of the dead." Elena moved to stand beside Matthias, her warmth a anchor point in the suddenly unstable reality of the room. "Show him the rules," she said to the keeper. "If he's to survive what comes next, he must understand how this sanctuary functions." The keeper nodded and gestured toward the cottage walls. The timber began to shimmer, revealing layers of protection woven into the very foundation, silver threads that pulsed with moonlight, circles of salt blessed by those who had died peacefully, and beneath it all, the profound weight of love that had built this place stone by stone. "This cottage exists because it was created through sacrifice freely given," the keeper explained. "Your wife died protecting what you built together. Your daughter perished defending the idea that home could exist even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Their deaths transformed this space into something beyond mortal geography. A trap," Victor's voice came through the door, now edged with uncertainty. "A pretty cage designed to steal what you are." "A choice," Sarah corrected, finally speaking. Her child's voice carried harmonics that made the silver threads in the walls sing softly. "The choice to value connection over power, growth over safety, love over fear." Matthias felt the truth of it settling into his bones like warmth after long cold. The cottage wasn't stripping away his vampiric nature, it was offering him the chance to choose something else, but that choice came with costs he was only beginning to understand. "Victor won't give up," he said, watching shadows move past the windows as the ancient vampire circled their sanctuary. "He has other followers, vampires who see this as weakness to be exploited. Then you must learn quickly," the keeper replied. "The rules of this threshold, the allies who walk between worlds, the enemies who would see love itself destroyed rather than allow redemption to take root." Outside, Victor's frustrated roar shook snow from the cottage roof. But inside, surrounded by impossible protections and faced with teachers who defied every law of reality he thought he understood, Matthias began his first lesson in becoming human again. The war for his soul was just beginning. The first lesson came at dawn, when the cottage walls began to hum with harmonics that made Matthias's teeth ache. He had not slept, could not sleep, knowing Victor circled their sanctuary like a wolf, testing the boundaries of a shepherd's fire. Through the night he had watched the keeper arrange objects on the table with ritualistic precision: a mirror that reflected nothing, 3 candles that burned without melting, and a bowl of water that steamed despite never being heated. "The threshold exists in constant tension," the keeper explained, her starlight robes shifting colors with each word, between mortal and immortal, between what was lost and what might be redeemed. To survive here, you must learn to navigate contradictions that would drive ordinary minds to madness. Sarah approached the table with the casual confidence of someone far older than her apparent years. When she touched the mirror's surface, images flickered across its empty face. Scenes of vampires gathering in abandoned castles, their crimson eyes fixed on something beyond the reflection's reach. Matthias recognized several faces from his centuries of isolation: Constantine the Bloodletter, Morgrim of the Eastern Reaches, others whose names had become legends whispered in fearful taverns. "They come," Sarah said simply. "Victor's rage has awakened old alliances. They see your transformation not as personal choice, but as existential threat." The observation sent ice through Matthias's mortal veins. He had always been a solitary creature, avoiding the complex politics of vampire society. But his connection to Victor ran deeper than casual acquaintanceship. They were bound by the ancient rights of maker and progeny, links that could not be severed simply by crossing magical thresholds. "If they breach the sanctuary," he began. "They cannot," Elena interrupted, settling beside him at the table. "Not while the cottage stands. But you cannot remain here forever. Eventually you must venture beyond these walls, and when that happens—" She gestured toward the steaming bowl, and Matthias saw his own face reflected in its surface. Not as he was now, mortal and vulnerable, but as Victor would see him, a betrayer who had abandoned his vampiric nature for the weakness of human emotion, a weapon that had turned against its wielder. The keeper lifted one of the eternal candles, its flame dancing without consuming the wick. "There are others who walk the threshold between worlds, beings who understand that redemption requires allies, not merely good intentions. But alliances demand trust, and trust—" She paused, studying Matthias with eyes that held the depth of mountain lakes. "Trust requires you to believe in your own worthiness of salvation." The challenge struck at the heart of his doubt. 3 centuries of vampiric existence had been built on the foundation that he was irredeemably lost, too stained by blood to deserve forgiveness, too broken by grief to risk love again. The cottage offered impossible hope, but accepting that hope meant dismantling every psychological defense that had enabled his survival. "Victor knows your weaknesses," Elena said gently, her hand covering his. "He will use them. The guilt over your transformation, the fear of failing to protect what you love, the certainty that you deserve punishment rather than grace. These are weapons in his arsenal." Outside, the dawn wind carried voices. Not Victor's alone now, but a chorus of supernatural predators drawn by the scent of vulnerability. They could not enter the sanctuary, but their presence pressed against the cottage walls like a gathering storm. Matthias felt their hunger as a physical weight, a reminder of what he had been, and what they would force him to become again. Sarah moved to the window, her small hands tracing symbols on the frost-etched glass. Where her fingers touched, the ice melted and reformed into patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometries that existed in spaces between mortal comprehension. "The threshold has rules," she said without turning from her work. "But so does the choice you made. By accepting your mortality, you gained access to powers that vampires cannot touch. Love as shield rather than weakness. Hope as weapon rather than delusion. Connection as strength rather than vulnerability." The keeper approached with the mirror, angling its surface so Matthias could see the gathered vampires more clearly. They moved with predatory grace around the cottage's perimeter, testing for weaknesses that did not exist. But their circling pattern revealed something else: uncertainty. Victor's assured commands carried an edge of desperation that suggested even he did not fully understand the forces they faced. "They fear you," Matthias realized with startling clarity. "Not what you were, but what you've become. A vampire who chose mortality threatens everything they believe about their own damnation," Elena confirmed. "If redemption is possible for you, what excuse do they have for embracing monstrosity?" The cottage shuddered as something massive struck the walls. Not Victor this time, but coordinated assault from multiple directions. The silver threads within the timber flared brighter, holding against supernatural fury through sheer force of sacrificial love. Yet Matthias could feel the strain, the gradual wearing away of protections that had seemed absolute mere hours ago. "Then we prepare," he said, meeting the keeper's ancient gaze. "Teach me these threshold rules. Show me these allies who walk between worlds. Because Victor is right about one thing, this sanctuary cannot hold forever." The war for his soul had found him at last. The second lesson began when the cottage walls started to bleed. Matthias watched in horror as crimson seeped through the timber, pooling on the floor despite the silver threads that should have protected them. The keeper moved with sudden urgency, her starlight robes darkening as she pressed her palms against the weeping wood. "They've found a way in," she said, her ageless voice strained. "Not through force, but through connection. Victor is calling the blood debt." The words hit Matthias like a physical blow. Blood debt, the most ancient and binding of vampire laws. When a maker transformed a mortal, they became linked not just by shared nature, but by the literal mingling of their essence. It was a connection that transcended death, mortal choice, even the sanctuary's protections. "No," Elena breathed, understanding immediately. "That's impossible. The threshold should—" "The threshold protects against external assault," the keeper interrupted as more blood welled through the walls. "But blood debt operates from within. It recognizes no sanctuary save the grave itself." Outside, Victor's laughter echoed with centuries of cruel triumph. "Did you think mortality could sever what was forged in your dying breath? You are mine, Matthias Corvain. You have always been mine." Sarah turned from the window, her young face grave. "The debt can be challenged, but not here. Not while you remain within the cottage's protection. To break Victor's claim, you must face him on neutral ground." The blood was spreading now, coating the floor with the metallic stench of old violence. Where it touched the protective salt circles, they hissed and dissolved like snow in flame. The cottage's warmth began to fade, replaced by the bone-deep cold that had defined Matthias's vampiric existence. "If I leave the sanctuary," he began. "You'll be vulnerable," Elena finished. "Mortal, facing creatures with 3 times your strength and centuries more experience." She stood, moving to a wooden chest he hadn't noticed before. "But you won't face them alone." From the chest, she withdrew objects that seemed to exist on the edge of vision. A blade that reflected starlight despite the cottage's dim interior, a pendant that hummed with harmonics similar to the walls themselves, and a vial of water that moved with impossible currents. "Threshold weapons," the keeper explained, though her attention remained focused on holding back the spreading blood. "Forged in spaces between worlds. They respond not to vampiric strength, but to the purity of mortal choice." Matthias reached for the blade and felt it sing against his palm, not with bloodthirst, but with something far more complex. Memory flooded through the metal, other redeemed souls who had wielded these weapons, mortals who had faced immortal enemies and emerged victorious through sacrifice rather than strength. "The blood debt has one weakness," Sarah said, her child's voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "It assumes the debtor remains unchanged. But you are no longer the broken man Victor transformed. You've remembered love, chosen connection over isolation, accepted mortality over endless hunger. The debt binds what you were, not what you've become." The cottage shuddered as Victor's assault intensified. Through the bleeding walls, Matthias could hear other voices, Constantine's guttural commands, Morgrim's whispered threats, a dozen vampires united in their determination to drag him back to damnation. They saw his transformation as existential heresy, proof that their own choices had been unnecessary. "How long before the sanctuary fails completely?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. The keeper's robes had gone completely dark now, her strength visibly draining as she fought to contain the blood debt's influence. Minutes, perhaps less. The cottage was built to protect against external threats, not this internal corruption. Elena pressed the pendant into his hand, her touch warm against his mortal skin. "There's a clearing 1/2 mile north, where the old standing stones mark the boundary between worlds. Neutral ground that recognizes no master. If you can reach it—" "When I reach it," Matthias corrected, surprised by his own certainty. The fear was still there. Terror of facing creatures he could no longer match in raw power, dread of failing to protect what he loved for a second time. But beneath the fear ran something stronger, the quiet determination of a man who had finally found something worth dying for again. Sarah moved to the door, her small hands working symbols that made the iron hinges glow with protective light. "The threshold will give you one gift," she said. "A single moment when the choice you've made blazes bright enough to blind vampiric senses. Use it wisely." The blood had reached the cottage's center now, pooling around their feet despite their elevated position. Matthias could feel Victor's presence pressing against his mind, not the crude mental domination of vampire mesmerism, but the deeper connection of maker to progeny. It whispered of safety and surrender, of the elegant simplicity of predatory existence. He gripped the threshold blade tighter and felt its song drown out Victor's seductive lies. Whatever happened in the clearing, whatever price redemption ultimately demanded, he would face it as the man he chose to be, rather than the monster circumstance had made him. The cottage walls cracked like breaking ice, and cold wind howled through the gaps. "Now," Elena whispered. Matthias stepped into the storm. The moment Matthias crossed the threshold, Victor's trap snapped shut. The storm was a lie, not wind and snow, but a writhing mass of shadow shapes that coalesced into vampiric forms. They had been waiting mere feet from the door, close enough that his mortal senses couldn't detect their presence until escape became impossible. Constantine's massive frame blocked the path north toward the standing stones, while Morgrim's skeletal fingers traced binding runes in the air that made the threshold blade's song falter and die. "Did you think we hadn't learned patience in 3 centuries? Victor's voice came from everywhere at once, his form materializing from the swirling darkness. "Did you imagine we would face you honorably, as if you still deserved a warrior's death?" The blood debt pulled at Matthias's consciousness like iron chains, no longer held at bay by the cottage's failing protections. He tried to raise the threshold blade, but his mortal strength meant nothing against vampiric speed. Constantine's backhand sent him sprawling into the snow, the weapon spinning away into shadows that swallowed it completely. Behind him, the cottage walls cracked wider. Through the gaps, he could see Elena pressing her hands against the keeper's shoulders, trying to keep the ancient guardian conscious as the sanctuary's collapse drained her remaining strength. Sarah stood at the window, her young face twisted with anguish as she watched the trap unfold. "The neutral ground," Matthias gasped, spitting blood onto the frozen earth. "You cannot—" "Cannot what?" Morgrim's laugh was like breaking glass. "Honor supernatural law. We are beyond such niceties now. Your betrayal threatens the fundamental order of our existence. For that heresy, all covenants are void." They converged on him with predatory grace, moving too fast for his mortal vision to track. Victor reached him first, iron-strong fingers closing around his throat with just enough pressure to restrict breathing without crushing his windpipe entirely. The ancient vampire's crimson eyes blazed with 3 centuries of accumulated rage. "You will return," Victor hissed, his breath carrying the charnel reek of recent feeding. "But not as the man you've pretended to become. I will drain you to the edge of death, then force my blood down your throat until mortality burns away like morning mist. This time, I will ensure your human weakness dies completely." The blood debt sang in harmony with Victor's words, reminding Matthias of every moment he had embraced his vampiric nature. The nights he had hunted through village streets, the warmth he had stolen from innocent throats, the decades when he had convinced himself that monstrosity was simply another form of honesty. The debt recognized the darkness, called to it, offered the seductive comfort of surrendering choice to ancient imperatives. "No," he whispered, though the word came out as barely a breath. Victor's grip tightened. "Yes. You cannot resist what you are, what you have always been." Through the cottage's broken walls, Matthias heard Elena scream, not in fear, but in desperate fury. The keeper had collapsed completely, her starlight robes fading to mundane grey as the sanctuary's protections unraveled. Without the threshold's power to shield them, they would be helpless when Victor turned his attention to completing the destruction he had begun centuries ago. The realization struck deeper than any physical blow. He had failed again, failed to protect what he loved, failed to prove that redemption was possible, failed to justify the impossible gift of mortality that had been freely given. The cottage would fall, Elena would burn, and Sarah would face whatever terrible truth lay behind her existence without the protection his choice was meant to provide. Constantine stepped closer, flexing claws that gleamed with supernatural sharpness. "Shall I begin with the woman? Or would you prefer to watch the child die first?" "Both," Victor decided with casual cruelty. Let him see the price of choosing weakness over strength. The blood debt pulled harder, offering escape through surrender. If he stopped fighting, stopped clinging to his fragile mortality, the pain would end. Victor would transform him again, and the guilt of failure would dissolve beneath the blessed clarity of predatory purpose. He would forget why he had ever valued love over power, connection over safety. The threshold blade lay buried in the snow mere yards away, its song reduced to the faintest whisper. Even if he could reach it, his mortal strength would be useless against the gathered vampires. The pendant Elena had given him felt cold against his chest, its protective harmonics overwhelmed by Victor's influence. Behind him, wood splintered as the cottage walls gave way completely. The keeper's unconscious form tumbled into the snow, her ancient power finally exhausted. Elena's defiant shouts were cut short by the sound of supernatural movement, predators closing on helpless prey. Matthias closed his eyes and felt the last of his hope drain away like blood in snow. The blood debt reached for his heart, and this time he had no strength left to resist.